In the last few lectures, we learned how prototypal inheritance works in JavaScript. And we did that with several different techniques like function constructors, classes, and also object.create method. Now, so far, what we have done is we have created a blueprint using either function constructor or a class or by using object.create method. And based on that blueprint, we instantiated objects. And those objects inherit the properties and methods which is attached to the prototype property of blueprint. For example, here let's say we have this person blueprint and we have created this person blueprint using function constructor. All right. Now to the prototype property of this person function constructor, we have attached this calculate age method. Okay. Now, based on this person function constructor, we are instantiating this John object. So here, this John object is inheriting this calculate age method because it is an instance of this person function constructor. So this is what we have done so far. We made instances inherit properties and methods attached to the prototype property of function constructor or a class or object.create method. But so far we have not talked about how one function constructor can inherit properties and methods from another function constructor, right? We have also not talked about how one class can inherit properties and methods of another class, right? For example, let's say we have two function constructors. One is person function constructor, another is employee function constructor. All right, now this person function constructor has this name, birth year, gender, and this calculate age method. And this employee is also a person. So this employee constructor should also have name, birth year, and gender property along with employee ID, salary, and company property. And it should also have access to the calculate age method and calculate salary method. Okay, so one way is we can create this employee function constructor and we can set these properties for the employee function constructor. Okay, so we can set name, birth year, gender property, employee ID, salary, and company property for this employee function constructor, and we can attach calculate age method and calculate salary method to the prototype of employee function constructor. Or what we can do is we can make this employee function constructor inherit this name, birth year, and gender property and calculate age method, right? But so far, we have not talked about how we can do this. So in this lecture, you are going to learn how we can make one function constructor inherit properties and methods of another function constructor. Okay? Now here we have a person function constructor, and this person function constructor we are for this person function constructor we are setting name, gender, and birth year property. And from where the value of these properties are coming, it is coming as an argument for this function constructor. And to the prototype of this function constructor we are attaching this calculate age method. All right, so when we create an instance based on this person function constructor, in that case, that instance will inherit this calculate age method. Let's see that. Let's create this John instance, and it should be an instance of this person function constructor. So now we need to pass value for name, gender, and birth year. Let's do that. So let's say name is John, gender is male, and birth year is 1990. Okay, so in this way we are creating this John object. Let's log this John object in the developer console. And let's save the changes. So here, this John is an instance of this person function constructor. And since it is an instance of this person function constructor, it will inherit this calc age method, which is attached to the prototype of person function constructor, right? So that is present in the proto property of this John object. And we have already learned about all these things. Now what we want is, we want to create another function constructor called employee. So let's do that. Let's call it employee. And this employee function constructor is going to have name, gender, birth year property, and also employee ID and salary property. And the values for those properties will come as argument for this function constructor. So let's say those values will come in these parameters. So name, gender, birth year, employee ID, and salary. All right. Now we also need to set these properties inside this function constructor. So this dot name equals name, and let's do the same thing for other properties. Okay. And this employee function constructor is also going to implement two methods. So calc salary method and employee detail method. So let's attach those methods to the prototype of this employee. So let's say employee dot prototype dot calc salary. Okay, function, and inside this, let's say this salary is monthly salary, and this calc salary will return annual salary of the employee. So for that, we can simply say return this dot salary multiplied by 12, and that's it. Similarly, let's add another method to the prototype of this employee. So employee dot prototype dot emp details. So employee details. Let's assign a function here, and inside this function we are simply going to log employee's name and his ID. So this dot name, and let's also log employee ID. Okay, so this is our employee function constructor. Now let's create an instance of this employee function constructor. Let's call this instance mark, and let's say new employee, and now we have to pass values for name, gender, birth year, employee ID, and salary. So let's say name is Mark, Mark is male, birth year 1995, employee ID 101, and salary is 12,000. Let's save the changes, and let's also log this Mark object in the developer console. All right, so here the Mark object is logged, and this Mark object is an instance of employee object. Okay, employee function constructor. If I expand this Mark object, it has this birth year, employee ID, gender, name, and salary property, and it also has calc salary and employee details. Now we also want to have a calc age method for this, for this employee instance. That means this Mark object, and we don't have that. Now here, this employee function constructor is independent of this person function constructor. Now, if you notice inside this person function constructor, we are already setting this name, gender, and birth year property. And we are doing the same thing inside this employee function constructor as well. Now here, there are two problems. The first problem is, first of all, we are violating the dry principle. That means do not repeat yourself, because this same code we are writing inside this employee function constructor as well. All right. And the other problem is, let's say in future, we also want to have city and country property for person. In that case, we will have to add it for the person constructor as well as for the employee constructor, because an employee is also a person. So we will also want to have those properties for employee objects, right? So in that way, the code, the maintenance of code will become cumbersome, because let's say we added the city and country property for person constructor, but we missed to add those properties for employee constructor. Okay, so in that way, the code will become less maintainable. So what is the solution here? The solution is, we can inherit these three properties from this person constructor instead of setting it for employee here. Okay, so we want to inherit the properties, these properties, this name, gender, and birth year properties of this person function constructor inside employee function constructor. And how can we do that? We can do that by simply calling this person function constructor inside this employee function constructor. Okay, now when we call this person function constructor, we need to pass the values for name, gender, and birth year property. Now these values are coming inside these parameters. So let's pass these parameters to person constructor. Okay. Now, do you think this will work? Let's see that. Let's save the changes. And here you see we are creating this mark object based on this employee object. Okay. So this mark object should have name, gender, birth year, employee ID, and salary property. And it should also inherit this calc salary, employee detail, and this calc age method. All right. Let's see if that happens. Let me save the changes. And here, if you notice, this employee object, the mark object which we have created using this employee function constructor, it only has employee ID and salary property. That means these two properties. But it does not have name, gender, and birth year property, right? Also, if I expand this proto property, it has access to calculate salary method, which is attached to the prototype of employee, and also employee details, which is also attached to the prototype of employee. But it does not have access to this calc age method, right? Now, why it is not working? That's because here we are making a regular function call. When we are calling this first person function constructor, we are not using any new keyword, right? So this is a regular function call. And in case of a regular function call, this variable inside that function points to global window object. So this variable inside this person, these variables, it will point to global window object. That means in that case, these properties will be set on Windows object, right? And to prove this point, let's inspect window object. If I expand this window object, you will notice that somewhere we will have this birth year property. So here you can see this gender property is set on the window object. Similarly, this name property is set on window object, and we should also have birth year property somewhere up, but I'm not able to find it. But this birth year property, this will also get set on the window object. Okay, because since we are making a regular function call here, in case of a regular function call, this variable inside that function points to window object, and that's why these properties are set on the window object. Okay, but what do we want? We want to set these properties on the instance which we are creating using employee function constructor. That means we want this variable inside this function to point to this mark object, right? So how can we do that? Well, we will have to explicitly set the value of this variable to point to mark object here. And if you remember, we learned about call, bind, and apply method. And these methods are used to set the value of this variable explicitly. So on this person, let's use call method. Now the first argument for the call method is the object to which we want this variable to point to. Now in this case, we want this variable to point to the instance of this employee function constructor, right? So here, let's pass this. Now we learned in the function constructor lecture that this new operator makes sure that this variable inside the function constructor points to the object which we are creating. So this variable here, when we are instantiating this mark object, this variable here will point to mark object, and we want to set this variable inside this person constructor to point to mark object as well. And that's why we are passing this here, because this here, Currently it is equivalent to mark object. Let's give a comment here. Okay, so currently when we are instantiating mark object, this here is pointing to mark object. So that means when we say this here, for this instance, this is pointing to mark object. That means here we are passing mark object to this person function constructor. And in this way, now this variables here inside this person function constructor will point to this mark object. Okay, let's see that. If I save the changes now you can see this employee has name, gender, and birth year property along with employee ID and salary property. And if I expand the proto property, it has calc salary and employee detail, but it still does not have access to calc age method, which is attached to the prototype of person function constructor. And we will fix that in a bit. Okay, so here this employee object, this employee function constructor is now inheriting the properties of this person function constructor. Okay, so this employee is a child class of this person. So employee here is child class, and this person here is parent class, and we also call it base class. Okay, now we also want to inherit this calc age method attached to the prototype of this person function constructor. Now how can we do that? That's again very simple. All we have to do is, once the properties are set, we also want to set the prototype, this employee.prototype, to the prototype of person function constructor. Okay, so to this prototype. Okay, so we want to set the prototype of employee to the prototype of person. So let's say employee dot prototype equals person dot prototype, and that's it. Let's save the changes. Let's expand this employee object. So it has all these 5 properties: birth year, employee ID, gender, name, and salary. And if I expand the proto property, now we also have access, this mark object also have access to the calc age method along with calc salary and employee details. Now one thing you need to remember here is that when you set the prototype property of child object to the prototype property of parent object, it should be done before you attach any methods to the prototype property of child object. Okay, so here I am setting the prototype property of employee object to the prototype property of person object before we are attaching any method to the prototype of employee object. Now if I do it after attaching these methods, so let me cut it from here and let's attach it. Let's set the prototype property to the prototype property of parent object after attaching these methods to the prototype of child object. Now what will happen in this case? In this case, if I save the changes, you will notice that now in the proto property we have only calc age method. We don't have calc salary and employee detail methods. Why is that? That is because after setting these methods on the prototype of employee, we are changing the prototype to the prototype of person. Let's understand this with a simple example. So let's say I have this variable x and I set it to 10. Then I have this variable y. I set it to 20. And after that I say x equals y. Now what will be the value of x in this case? Of course it will be 20, right? And that's the same thing is happening here. Even though we attached calc salary and employee details to the prototype of this employee object, after that we are setting the prototype of this employee object to the prototype of person. Now the prototype of person only has one calc age method, and that's what it is setting it. Okay, so this prototype is now containing only calc age method. These two methods which we attached earlier is gone now. And that's why we should always do it before attaching any method to the prototype of child object. Okay, Save the changes, and now it should have all the three methods. So in this way, this employee function constructor is inheriting the properties and methods of this person function constructor. All right. Now, I know this lecture might be a bit confusing for many of you, but if you have gone through my previous lectures on function constructors and prototypal inheritance, then it should not be a big deal to understand what I am trying to convey here. Again, if you have any questions related to this lecture, related to inheritance between two function constructors, then feel free to ask it. This is all from this lecture. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.